All right, folks, let's talk some Gators here at the Voice of College Football. We appreciate David Soderquist stopping by from High Top Sports. You can catch his work and everybody there at High Top Sports. It's right here on YouTube. David, what's going on?
Keeping up with this transfer portal stuff, as much of a mess that it is, that we all it's chaos, man. With the new transfer rules, and you can instantly transfer just about at any time, unless you're in the SEC. You got to wait a year. It's chaos out there, really. So, with them also, adding that summer signing period that they're going to add, for high schoolers as well. Like, it's starting to really get crazy just in the recruiting world, high school wise, and in the transfer portal as well.
So, before we get to all that mayhem, let's talk about what you checked out this past weekend. And really, if you put it all together, not just what you saw at the swamp, but the entirety of spring practice, where do you think this team made some progress?
I really think they made progress, a little bit of progress there on the offensive line. I saw a lot of good things in the spring game. I've heard some good things about a couple of offensive linemen, like Bryce Lovett, who's kind of really stepped up at that right tackle spot. Then you hear about Braden Crenshaw Dixon, who came in from the portal. Austin Barber's been really good too. You got Jake Slaughter coming back too at the center spot, like with his experience. So I've heard a lot of great things about the offensive line. And when you go to that spring game, the defensive line made a lot of good plays. It was actually, there were 6 sacks for, I think it was the blue team, and then 1 sack for the orange team. So it was the most sacks that I think one side of the football has had in a spring game history. But also, you had the offensive line kind of give Mertz a little bit of time there as well, throwing the football. You saw a couple deep passes there from him and DJ Lagway. So I'd say the offensive line's improved a little bit. You saw a lot of good plays from the defensive line. There's a lot of good depth and talent there too. I think the defensive line's been good. And what my biggest takeaway was from spring, and from what I've heard just in the practices, and then obviously you see it in the spring game, not a lot of missed tackles. I mean, Florida almost led the SEC in missed tackles last year. I think they were ranked 12th with over 100 missed tackles. And, you go and you look at that spring game, and there was some decent runs in that spring game, especially, from some of the running backs, but you didn't really see any of those big chunk plays from the running backs. You saw a 25-yard run from Jaden Ball and maybe like a 12 or 10, 15-yard run from maybe DJ Lagway, but you didn't see anything that was that big or explosive. And I think that was really good just on the tackling basis of the defense. So my big takeaway from the spring game and from these spring practices is the defense has played a lot better. They're obviously, we're returning 68% of our production. So I would hope that this team has played better. And I think it says a lot to the testament of the strength and conditioning, which was kind of lacking there with Mark Hockey. You bring in Fitzgerald there to clear that up. And you hear a lot of the players talk about how the strength and conditioning is a lot better, and they're hitting harder too. Like, if you've noticed that, you go look at that spring game, they're flying towards that football. They're hitting harder. So that's what you want to see out of a defense, because, I mean, let's face it, Mark, last year our defense started out really well, but then probably after game 4 or 5, it just became abysmal, and just all these teams are scoring on us. And it was reminding us back of the 2020 defense that we had to deal with when we went 8-4 and was scoring 40 points per game. So I think, I think the biggest takeaway from me was the tackling and the defense, even though there was a little bit of improvement on the offensive line as well.
David Soderquist breaking things down for the Florida Gators. High Top Sports is the place to be right here on YouTube for Florida football talk. David, so there was a player or 2 or 3 or however many you want to list that people will know about in, let's say, October and November, once Florida starts playing this ridiculous schedule that they may not know about right now. Who are those guys that have the biggest chance to come out of nowhere and become impact players in the SEC?
Well, obviously, I think you have to go with Eugene Wilson. I think that's a gimme, just based on what he did last year, the production that he had, catching, I believe, 500 to 600 yards just as a freshman. He had 128 yards in the spring game. I think that's just a gimme there. I think, and obviously, I want to say Graham Mertz, just based back on the second year that he's in the system. He talked a lot about like how he was still trying to learn the system at Florida. And if you look at the statistics he put up last year, I mean, they didn't jump off the page. He would have had over 3,000 yards if he had played in that Florida State game, but he had a 72.9% completion rating, only threw 3 picks. I think, the second jump from Graham Mertz being in the system from year 1 to year 2, I think that's really going to help him, especially with all the experience he's had as a quarterback over there at Wisconsin. I think another name that you may not expect is Aiden Mazzell. I mean, this kid, he flashed his speed in that spring game. I mean, he ran a 10.400 meter in high school. He was a little bit underweight the first year he came in. He's around 150 or so. He was battling with an injury that he had in high school, so he's recovering from that. And now he's back up to, I believe, around 180 or that 180 spot there. I think he's the kind of a guy that you'd have to look out for just based on his speed. He did have one touchdown in the spring game. I also liked what I saw from Jaden Ball. He had 12 carries, 77 yards. He averaged around 6.4 yards per carry in the spring game. He had a good run of 25 yards. And, you look at his high school tape, and Alabama was really after this running back too. And you see how much of a bruiser he is and how much of a big guy he is. I mean, he came in the roster 238 pounds, and you see that he's just a bruiser type of running back, but then you go and you watch that spring game, he's got some shift and wiggle to him as well. And he was making people miss and everything else on in front of the defensive line. So I think Jaden Ball might be a guy if he starts. Because you got Treyon Webb there that's been there for a year. You obviously Montrell Johnson's going to be your obvious starter there. And I think, Jaden Ball, he did pretty well in the spring, and I heard a lot about him. And then you watch him in the spring game. So if he gets the opportunity to get out there on the field, I think that's another guy. And I think on the defense, you have George Gums, who's been playing pretty well. He had a sack and a half in the spring game, 5 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss. I've heard his name a lot in the spring practices as well. And I think the biggest defensive guy that I've heard in the spring practices, you didn't really see a lot from him in the spring game, was DJ Douglas. I heard he has been a ball hawk out there during the spring practice, the transfer that came in over there, the transfer portal. So I think, those 4 names, and I think Pup Howard is another name you got to look out for, the transfer from South Carolina. He had, a pass breakup, 6 tackles in the game as well. He's been doing pretty well. I think that those are kind of the names defensively and offensively you kind of got to look out for. I would say Montrell Johnson, but I think that's a little bit more of a gimme. He's consistently had 800-yard rushing seasons. We'd love to see him pass, go to that 9,000, maybe that, 900, 1,000 yards, and maybe break the record there that Kelvin Taylor set in 2015 of going over 1,000 yards, because we haven't had a 1,000-yard rusher in about 10 years. So we're kind of looking at those kind of, I guess, players, but I don't like to do the gimme players. The Eugene Wilsons is an obvious gimme player. Montrell Johnson, maybe Graham Mertz stepping up. And I liked what I saw from DJ Lagway. And I think that, as the season goes on, I think you're going to see a little bit of packages with DJ Lagway as well.
Okay, here we go, Dave. You just brought up Lagway after talking about Mertz. So obviously, Mertz is thought of now as a game manager. That's what the thought of Graham Mertz is, because, of course, we know what Wisconsin does. And we know that he was reasonably successful, but didn't light the world on fire, had those amazing stats that you just laid out there. I think he came close to setting a record in the SEC for completion percentage. Anyway, this guy was a 5-star at one point. So maybe they're unlocking some things here in Florida that they just didn't have the opportunity because of the way they run a Wisconsin offense. If we knew Billy Napier had a job after next season, like if that was a given, if he had complete job security, would there be an argument, knowing that 2024 is probably a bit of a lost season, to play DJ Lagway start to finish and just say, we're gunning for the future, let's ride with the kid?
Are you talking about playing him this year?
I'm
way?
Talking about playing him this year. And again, this would be if Billy Napier had job security. Of course, he's playing for a job, so he's going to play the surest thing, and that's Graham Mertz.
Yeah, I mean, just when you look at what he did in high school, the records he broke, making Max Preps Player of the Year, the Bobby Dodd Back Trophy, which is like the high school Heisman, Gatorade Player of the Year. I mean, pretty much every statistical and phenomenal award you can win in high school, he achieved. So that's what plummeted up there to be the number 1 player, and he averaged a 60 to 70% completion rating in high school. You watch him play in the spring game, and you can see where the freshman, not even really freshman mistakes, but the inexperience with the some of the route running and concepts. But you saw a lot of great plays that he had made in clutch plays where he had to make a quick decision, especially the ones in the end zone. I don't know if you saw the passes in the end zone that he had made. I thought that really jumped out to me. And just as a freshman, and the arm strength he's got, the intangibles, If your job wasn't on the line, I would still say you play Graham Mertz. Now, if Mertz tends to struggle, and this is a question I brought up to a lot of people, I said, well, what if you go into the season and say you started out 3-2, right? Just say you start out 3-2, and it's not looking that great, and Graham Mertz is struggling. Do you start Lagway and maybe see what you can get out of him and see what the future is like? I mean, because if Lagway comes into some of these games and say like you're losing by like 20 points, and then they say, all right, let's bench Mertz, let's put Lagway in, and he gets you 2 or 3 touchdowns. Are you going to start in the next game? You probably would, maybe in a certain scenario as a head coach. But like, if your record, say you only win 6 or 7 again, but Lagway looks phenomenal, do you keep Billy Napier around for one more year just to see what DJ Lagway can do? I think that's another scenario or question. And I've brought that up, and a lot of people would say, I would be interested to see what Lagway could do if you kept Billy Napier around. So I think in a way, Graham Mertz, he possesses everything that you want in a quarterback. I think just based on the inexperience, it wouldn't happen. But if you throw all that out the window, I wouldn't be opposed to starting DJ Lagway and just seeing what he could do.
All right, Dave, as we talked about before we started to record, the transfer portal has been pretty much off the radar for Florida at this point, but they just got through the spring game based on scholarship requirements, based on position needs, everything in the mix. Do we expect anything to come up here in the next few days or weeks?
It's been a very quiet spring portal period for Florida. I mean, they're at their 85 limit right now. I give or take some players that may hop into the portal. I haven't really inquired about that right now, so I'm kind of waiting to see. Obviously, they have visitors. They have Justice Ross Simmons from Colorado State. He's visiting there. He had 45 passes caught for 724 yards last year, 63.4 PFF receiving grade. Not really that phenomenal, I guess, but not really that bad either. But the intangibles are there for him to be a good, experienced receiver to bring in such a young receiving core. I mean, you go and you look at the wide receivers that Florida has. A lot of those guys. I mean, you have Marcus Burke, Jaquavian Frazier's have been there for a while, but nobody is really, they haven't really made that next jump. Marcus Burke has made plays and he's made splashes, but the consistency has lacked in the past years. Now you're starting to see him a lot more out there on the field. So I believe you'll see a lot of Marcus Burke, but they really want to get an experienced wide receiver in there from a good, obviously P5 school. And this is the guy that they evaluated and brought in. And I remember a lot of people saying, look, all the quarterbacks you had to go after, why did you get Graham Mertz last year? And then turn around, he's vastly improved from what he looked like at Wisconsin. I think the staff does a lot of good evaluations on players, and I think when they brought him in here, they did their evaluations and they looked at tape and everything else, and they said, okay, we'll bring him in here for a visit. He's supposed to visit this weekend, so I think adding him would add some experience to the wide receiver core because you really need an experienced guy. I guess a Ricky Pearsall replacement. I'm not going to say he's going to be Ricky Pearsall, but somebody to replace that experience there. And you also got to look at offensive line. I know that Jason Zandamela, he's visiting UCF right now as of Tuesday and Wednesday. And I think if Florida can survive him visiting UCF and him not coming to, or him coming to Florida within the next weekend or the weekend after, I think that puts you in a good spot. Usually in the transfer portal, when you're evaluating players in high school, they say the last visit is the best visit to have. Transfer portal, the first visit is always the visit to have because then you can say, hey, here's your NIL. This is what we're going to do. We don't want you going here. We want you here. And you can usually close the deal in the transfer portal as opposed to high school. So he's at UCF and he's a 4-year player, former 5-star. Something Florida's lacked. The talent that they've brought in through high school, really not high on a star level. Couple of guys that are 4 stars, top 150 guys, but never have they brought in like a big time 5-star player. And I think that Jason Zandamela will add that and add his frame and add his skill set. Obviously, he's not experienced, but they're pretty happy. If you talk to anybody that, to the staff or Billy Napier, they're pretty happy with who they brought in on the offensive line. So Zandamela is that kind of up in the air guy. We don't know if that would happen or not, but I know if you were to tell me who to pick from, that would probably happen. It would be Justice Ross Simmons over Jason Zandamela, but I'm also not predicting the Powerball here either, so I don't know what's going to happen. But those are kind of the 2 targets that they're after right now. There really hasn't been any other targets that they've really looked at. And maybe there's some guys that say, okay, well, if this guy doesn't work out and he can't transfer here, let's go look at this guy. I'm sure that they have a backboard of who they're evaluating and who they're going to probably interview next if something doesn't work out. But those are the two main guys that Florida's after right now. Just a wide receiver, offensive lineman. They haven't really lost anybody to the portal except for Manny Nunnery, the spring portal period. So I wouldn't expect it to be very active, but I would expect Florida to try to add up like a few more positions before the spring portal period's up.
We appreciate the conversation with David Soderquist. High Top Dave. That's the X handle. You see it right there on the banner. High Top Sports is right here on YouTube. David, we appreciate you stopping by. I always enjoy the conversation and the breakdown, sir.
You're welcome, Mark. Anytime, man.